Have you ever wondered how far a person can endure before something inside it is completely broken? The story I will share today has been hidden for a long time, buried in the folds of the official narratives that prefer to forget certain names. Richmond's Hannah is not just another footnote in American history. What she did in an cold April dawn 1793 caused shockwaves that crossed generations. Many documents about her have mysteriously disappeared, as if someone wanted to erase their existence. But there are secrets that refuse to die, no matter how many times they try to bury them. Here on the channel, we seek these truths that others prefer not to play. If you care about the silenced voices of our history, this account will move something deep on you. Hannah's case is one of those who force us to look at the dark corners of the human soul, to understand what happens when all hope is gone. Stay with me until the end, as there are details in this story that have never been revealed before. Get ready to meet a woman who turned her unbearable pain into something no one could predict. The first rays of sunshine barely touched the Blackwood mansion brick walls when the silence of the dawn was torn by muffled screams. The property, previously proud of the high society of Richmond, Virginia, had become a red scenario on this Friday of the holy 1793. Remains of wax candles were still shaking in the main rooms, while the cold mist of dawn mingled with the metal odor that now impregnated corridors. Hannah remained motionless, stained bare feet, controlled breathing, watching the first birds cut the sky, his fixed eyes on his hands that had just rewrite his destiny. The blade he had used to cut the wheat for 6 straight years served for another purpose at dawn. The magistrates would later write in their reports that they had never witnessed such precision in an act of such savagery, but none of them would mention the marks on the back of Hannah, the names she had lost, or her children torn from her arms. The truth about that morning goes far beyond official records. At this critical moment of our collective history, we need to look back without fear of what we will find. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Hannah's story reminds us that true freedom sometimes has a price that few are willing to pay. The tobacco fields of the Blackwood plantation stretched 42 acres of fertile land on the banks of the James River. The main house, built in 1752 with noble wood imported from Europe, rose as a monument to the wealth of the Blackwood, one of the most influential families of colonial Virginia. With 22 bedrooms, a library with 3,000 volumes and a dining room capable of accommodating 50 guests, the property was a place of elite meetings. In the back, invisible to illustrious visitors, 42 cabins aligned in 5 rows housed 157 slaves, responsible for the entire functioning of this small empire. George Blackwood, the 3rd generation of the family in America, managed the property with what he called the unfailing control system. Each slave received a daily quota of production, heavy at dusk. Each jaguar below the goal resulted in a whip applied to the central trunk, visible from all cabins. Punishment sessions always took place after dinner of Casa Grande, so that the sound of the whips would follow the digestion of the masters. The foreman, Thomas Miller, a 2-meter high man and scars on his face, performed the punishments while the other slaves were forced to watch. The sweet and nauseating smell of tobacco leaves mixed with the sweat, mud, and metallic odor of the blood that periodically staining the beaten floor from the central area. The days on the Blackwood property were marked by the bell that played at 4 in the morning and only stopped at dusk, when the hands were bleeding and the back seemed to leave in half. Among the rows of tobacco plants, the whisper of the wind on the leaves mixed with the muffled moans and the mutual prayers in tongues that you did not understand. Children learned early to work. At the age of 5, they were already harvested the leaves. At 8, they were already working on drying greenhouses. At 12, they already had the same quota as the adults. Blackwood were known for their efficiency in turning humans into production machines. The night before that Holy Friday, during dinner, the patriarch gave it to what he called another year of God-blessed prosperity. At the same time, at the back of the property, a blade was carefully sharp under the trembling light of a sebum candle. Hannah had reached Blackwood Property D at 17 in 1782. Unlike most, she did not come from Africa, but from another plantation in North Carolina, sold to pay for her former gentleman's game debts. His parents and siblings were sent to New Orleans. He would never see them again. On the previous property, Hannah had worked at Casa Grande, learning to read hidden while clearing the library. He knew how to prepare herb remedies, knew the secrets of the French cuisine that the former lady enjoyed so much, and had developed an impressive ability to take care of the sick, knowledge she had brought from her grandmother, a healer respected even by whites. In Richmond, George Blackwood soon realized that he had something valuable. Hannah spoke English fluently, understood medicine, and, most importantly, was transiting between two worlds. Soon she took care of the health of the Blackwood family and her guests, preparing tonics, syrups, and poultice that relieved from fevers to digestive problems. The other slaves sought it hidden to heal their wounds after the whip, to watch complicated births, to relieve pain that would make it impossible to fulfill the quotas the next day. This privileged position allowed Hannah to have access to the entire property, knowing each corridor, every time, every routine. She watched silently as she delivered medicines in the rooms while replacing the candle of the candlesticks, while preparing the family's private meals. And in the slave community, his voice had the weight of those who could transmit information from side to side, from those who knew the conversations of the masters, who could warn of imminent sales or planned punishments. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. Hannah carried this truth hidden under her thick cotton clothes, while the world around her collapsed in ever larger cruelties. In the winter of 1786, George Blackwood decided to expand his production. More lands meant more work, and the rhythm in the plantations intensified. The first to fall was the 63-year-old Old Samuel, who simply collapsed among the tobacco ranks when his heart stopped. His body was dragged out, and the work continued. The following week, the 19-year-old Ruth, and 8-month-old pregnant, she received 30 whipping for not meeting her share. The baby was born dead the same night. 2 days later, twins James and John, just 12, were separated and sold to different owners, one for Pennsylvania coal mines, another for Georgia's sugarcane fields. Hannah watched and treated the wounds, prepared ointments to the torn back, held the hands of mothers who lost their children for sudden sales. In March 1787 came the order for 3 men considered problematic to be chained in the public exhibition of Richmond Square. For 3 days, without water or food, they were under the sun and rain, as an example. Only one came back alive. With each new atrocity, something changed in Hannah's eyes. His once compassionate expression acquired a hardness he never showed before the lords. At night, alone in her small room attached to the kitchen, privilege of her position, she designed mental maps of the property, memorizing schedules, studied the rotation of watchmen, told the steps between one building and another. In September 1789, Elizabeth Blackwood, George's wife, thought it would be fun to make a competition among slave children. The one that reaped more cotton in 12 hours would receive a piece of pie. At the end of the day, 2 children had passed out with exhaustion. You laughed, commenting that the small savages needed to learn the value of work early on. Hannah, who watched as she served water, felt something break inside him. That night, for the first time, she couldn't pray. On the morning of March 17, 1790, Hannah woke up with shouts. He ran to the bedroom next to the kitchen and found his only friend Abigail bleeding in the arms of another slave. At night, the teenage son of the Blackwood and 3 friends, drunk after a party, had dragged Abigail for the barn. When they finished, they marked it with red-hot iron, as it is done with cattle. She did not survive the injuries. Hannah washed her friend's body with warm water and sweet-smelling herbs, combed her hair with her fingers. It wrapped it on a white fabric that had kept for a special day. He sang softly songs that his grandmother had taught him, in a language that no one else understood. And while his hands realized these gestures of love and farewell, his eyes remained dry, fixed as if they observed something very distant. That night Hannah withdrew a small bundle from her mattress where she kept precious objects, a pearl button that had belonged to her mother, a page torn from a book of poems, a blue ribbon. Unfortunately, Abigail had given him a small knife of bone he had hidden for years. He put everything on a flat stone on the bedroom floor and, for the first time in 3 years, allowed himself to cry. When the tears dried up, he took a silent oath under the moonlight that entered the small window. A sealed commitment not with words, but with the absolute certainty of those who finally found their purpose. George Blackwood was just the most visible face of a system that branched into many directions. There was Thomas Miller, the foreman, who personally chose which women would receive the most severe punishment, always applied where clothes could hide the brands. There was James Wilson, the slave trader who visited the property every 3 months, examining men and women as horses for sale, separating families with the coldness of those who share a pile of coins. There was the Reverend Simmons, who on Sundays preached on the divine obedience that the servants owed their masters, while he had dozens of slaves himself on his property. There were local politicians who had dinner in the Blackwood mansion, discussing new laws to further restrict the already non-existent enslaved rights. The property was a perfectly organized microcosm of cruelty, where each gear worked to maximize suffering and profit. And at the center of this system, the Blackwood family, George, his wife Elizabeth, and the 19-year-old son Jonathan, who had recently begun to show a morbid interest in discipline. On October 14, 1791, the Blackwood mansion received important guests. The governor of Virginia and representatives of other colonies gathered to discuss what they called the growing problem of slave insubordination. News of revolts elsewhere, especially in the Caribbean, caused apprehension among the owners. New control methods, exemplary punishments, movement limitations were discussed. Hannah served at the table, silent and attentive. He heard when George Blackwood proposed definitive measures against any sign of rebellion. He saw the men nod as they cut baked meat and drank imported wine. That night, after the party, Jonathan Blackwood, drunk and encouraged by the conversations of older men, decided to give a lesson to the slaves of the countryside. He chose Samuel, a middle-aged man respected by all, falsely accusing him of looking with disrespect. Hannah watched, hidden behind a tree, while Samuel was tied and beaten until he lost consciousness. "This is the treatment for blacks who forget their place," announced the young Blackwood, staggering back to Casa Grande. Something cracked inside Hannah that night. A decision that had been forming for years crystallized in absolute certainty. It was no longer a matter of if, but when and how. Hannah's public humiliation took place on a hot May 1792 afternoon. Elizabeth Blackwood had woke up with a headache and blamed the tea Hannah had prepared. He dragged her by the hair to the central courtyard and shouted for all the slaves to gather. "See what happens when I privilege an ungrateful savage," he shouted as he ordered the foreman to apply 20 whip to Hannah's hands, his precious healer hands. The whip's leather cut the delicate skin of the palms that had so often relieved pain, brought children to the world, closed wounds. Hannah didn't make a sound. Her whole body trembled with each blow, but her eyes remained open, fixed on Elizabeth Blackwood. There was no supplication in that look, no visible hatred, only a silent promise that made you divert your face before the end of punishment. That night, with his hands wrapped in bloody rags, Hannah sat on the ground floor of his room. The pain pulsed like something alive, but his mind was extraordinarily clear. Each doubt had dissipated. Every hesitation, every hope that things could be different, had disappeared with the scams of the whip. In its place, there was only one crystal certainty. The plan that had been forming for years now had a date. Next Friday. A day when the Blackwood, fervent in their religious hypocrisy, would be home to celebrate the sacred date. Hannah knew she couldn't do everything on her own. I needed carefully chosen allies, few, reliable, determined as it. In the following weeks, as her hands healed, she observed, evaluated, chose. Isaiah, the coachman who knew all the roads within 50 miles. Bai, the washerwoman who had access to every room of the big house and knew exactly where each family member slept. Mosts, the blacksmith, who could provide the necessary tools and whose strength would be essential. Sarah, the cook who could tamper with food to ensure that night watchmen slept undently. They met in secret, 4 times, always in different places in the abandoned barn, in the woods behind the slave cemetery, on the riverbank while washing clothes. The plan gained shape, detailed as a map. Isaiah knew a community of free blacks and slaves fled in the 3-day Blue Ridge Mountains. Moses knew how to disable the horses of watchmen without killing them. Sarah could prepare a mixture of herbs that, placed in the food, would cause a deep sleep. And I knew how to move around the big house without noise, knew every ranging board, every door that needed oil. Hannah drew maps on earth with a twig, then deleted them, distributed tasks, calculated times, anticipated problems. They chose April 19th, the Holy Friday of 1793, a date when the family was gathered, where there would be less vigilance due to the religious celebration, where the darkness of the night would give enough time for the group to get a distance before the alarm was given. A month before the chosen date, Hannah began hiding provisions: hard bread, smoked meat, water bottles. Isaiah prepared the wagon, checking axes and wheels, hiding compartments under the floor. Moses forged discreetly new tools that could serve both the road and weapons work. Sarah collected specific herbs during her exits to seek wild seasoning, drying them hidden in the kitchen attic. The tension grew as the date approached. Each of the 5 conspired in his own way, risking herself daily, knowing that the slightest suspicion would mean torture and death. But none of them hesitated, even when Hannah, in a last meeting the night before, gave them the chance to give up. "Tomorrow night we will be free, or we will be dead," she said. "There is no other alternative." The 4 nodded in solemn silence. On the eve of Holy Friday, the Blackwood mansion shone with the light of dozens of candles. The family had received close guests to a religious supper: Reverend Simmons, 2 neighboring families, the local magistrate and his wife. In the main hall, crystals and silverware reflected golden light as conversations about politics and businesses mingled with occasional pious references to the approaching sacred date. In the back of the property, in the slave cabins, a tense silence hovered in the air. The 5 conspirators had kept the plan in a complete secret. No one but them knew what was about to happen out of security. Still, something in the atmosphere seemed different. Perhaps it was Hannah's particular look when he distributed medications earlier, or the way Isaiah checked the horses with extra attention, or extra Sarah care when preparing the watchman's dinner. Inside the big house, bowls tilled. Elizabeth Blackwood laughed loudly, her shrill voice cutting the night as Jonathan narrated a hunting story, gesturing with a glass of brandy in her hand. George Blackwood, at the head of the table, watched his family, his guests, his wealth displayed on each object of the hall. Reverend Simmons had just proposed a toast to the divine order that put each being in its proper place in this world. Meanwhile, Hannah was in her room, kneeling on a treadmill in front of small objects aligned on the floor: the Mother of Law, the blue ribbon, the book's page. Beside them, a sharp blade, almost as thin as a razor, which she had removed from an agricultural tool and patiently perfected for months. His lips moved in silent prayer, not to the Blackwood god, but to the ancestors who observed it from somewhere beyond the suffering of this earth. At midnight, the property bell rang, marking the official start of the Holy Friday. The last guest had departed minutes before. In the house of the watchman, 4 men fell into deep sleep, their cups of night tea still half. Isaiah checked the hidden wagon one last time on the edge of the woods. Moses left strategically positioned tools near the main road. Sarah packaged the last provisions, for her slid silently to Hannah's room with the news. Everyone slept. It's time. At 2 o'clock in the morning, under a moonless sky, Hannah moved as a shadow through the mansion corridors he knew so well. Her bare feet were no noise on the floor tablets she knew exactly where to step on. The blade, tied firmly to his right hand, occasionally reflected the weak glow of the embers in the fireplace of the hall. It had stayed outside, watching over. Moses and Sarah waited with the wagon, ready to leave. Isaiah was positioned on the main road to give the signal when everything was ready. Hannah first entered Jonathan Blackwood's room. The young man slept his stomach, snoring slightly, still dressed in the party's clothes. She approached the accuracy of those who have executed this movement 1,000 times in dreams. A quick movement, a muffled sound, and was done. There was no time for him to wake up completely. His eyes opened for a moment, confused, before they closed forever. The main room was at the end of the corridor. Hannah stopped for a moment before the door, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. It was not just for her, or for Abigail, or by Samuel. It was for all who had suffered in that place, by all who would still suffer if nothing were done. He took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. George and Elizabeth slept side by side on the large docile bed. The patriarch on his back, the lady, facing the window. Hannah approached him first. He leaned and whispered in man's ear, "Wake up, George Mass." Death came to charge his debt. Blackwood's eyes opened in terror to see who was leaning over him. He tried to scream, but Hannah had already put his hand over his mouth. "Remember, when did you sell Ruth's kids? When did Joseph's back to iron?" The next movement was fast and accurate, as if Hannah had practiced anatomy secret for years. The cut was deep, fatal. Beside her, Elizabeth began to awaken, alarmed with her movements in bed. She turned, still confused by sleep, and saw her husband debate, her throat open. Its scream was interrupted by the same accurate blade. "This is by humiliation, lady," said Hannah in an almost kind tone. "This is by the hands that you destroyed." 10 minutes later, Hannah left the mansion through the back door. His clothes were stained, but his step was firm and determined. By waiting for her, his eyes wide of fear and admiration. Together, they ran to where the others were waiting. Isaiah had already prepared the horses. Moses helped women climb the wagon while Sarah distributed dark cloaks to everyone. Before they departed, Hannah asked them to wait. He returned to a point where he could see the mansion. He withdrew a small torch that had turned on the coals of the kitchen and hurled it through an open window, straight to the heavy velvet curtains in the room. In minutes, the first flames became visible. Hannah noted for a moment, then turned her back and walked determined for the wagon. When they departed in the darkness, the first signs of smoke already climbed the Blackwood mansion. The light of the fire began to illuminate the sky behind them, while the five went north, towards the mountains. Behind, they left not only bodies and a fire, but a symbol that would be remembered for generations. Hannah commanded the small group for 3 days and 3 nights of strenuous travel. They avoided main roads, crossed streams to confuse sniffer dogs, hid in dense forests during the day. Isaiah knew the way to the Blue Ridge Mountains, where a community of fled blacks had set a secret settlement. On the morning of the 4th day, they arrived at a hidden clearing where rustic cabins housed about 40 people. They were received with initial caution that soon became welcome. That night, under the starry sky, Hannah led a ritual to the fire of bonfires. The 5 travelers and the inhabitants of the settlement formed a circle. In the center, she placed objects that symbolized her journey: a piece of fabric of the large house, land of the Blackwood plantation, the blade that had brought freedom. One by one, he threw the items into the fire while singing in an old language that few understood, but whose meaning they felt: purification, rebirth, liberation. When the last item was consumed by the flames, Hannah said to the gifts, "What we did cannot be undone. The way ahead will not be easy, but for the first time, we breathed like free people." That same night, they prepared to continue traveling. The small settlement would not be safe for long. Reward hunters would soon follow its trail. A larger group, 32 people including children, decided to leave with them to the north, towards Canada. Isaiah organized the fugitive column, distributing the few available supplies. Moses taught basic defense techniques to those who had never wielded a tool as a weapon. Sarah prepared medicines for the journey, while sewing detailed maps and clothing liners so that they could be easily hidden. Hannah moved among all, treating old wounds, telling stories of hope, turning a group of broken people into a community united by a goal. When they left at the next night, a long line of shadows moved silently through the forest, moving more and more from Virginia. When they arrived at the top from a hill, Hannah stopped for a moment and looked back toward Richmond. He could not see the Blackwood property, but he knew his name would already be on everyone's lips through that region, no longer how the slave healed, but as something new and terrifying for slave lords. The news of what had happened in the Blackwood plantation spread like fire in dry straw. Official reports described the incident as an unprecedented act of savagery, omitting the atrocities that preceded it conveniently. Alarmed letters circulated between landowners throughout Virginia, describing in graphic detail what Hannah had done, warning of the danger of privileged blacks who abuse the confidence of their benefactors. The governor of Virginia authorized the formation of special militias to hunt the fugitives. A $500 reward was offered by capturing Hannah, alive or dead. Slave owners increased safety in their plantations, installed locks in the rooms, started sleeping with weapons under the pillows. Fear settled in the big houses while in the senzalas, a new name with reverence and hope was whispering. In the following weeks, similar occurrences were reported in neighboring plantations. A house burned down in Petersburg. A owner found dead in his library in Charlottesville. An whole family missing near Fredericksburg. His slaves also disappeared. No one could prove direct connection with Hannah, but his method, precise, relentless, symbolic, seemed to have inspired others. The colonial authorities began to refer to these incidents as the Richmond method, in reference to the city where it all had begun. In response, new laws were proposed, further restricting the already limited movements of slaves. It was forbidden to learn to read or write, under penalty of mutilation. The rare permissions were suspended to visit family members on other properties. The number of night patrols increased, but for each new restriction, a new form of resistance emerged. The fire that Hannah had turned on could no longer be contained. In July 1793, almost 3 months after the escape, the group led by Hannah, now increased to 47 people, crossed the dense forests of Pennsylvania. The journey had been brutal. 5 died on the way, 2 elderly who could not stand the physical exertion, a child taken by the fever, a man injured when hunting, and a pregnant woman who could not resist premature birth. With each loss, Hannah drove a simple but deep ritual, burying the bodies with dignity, something her old masters would never give. The group moved mainly at night, using the stars as a guide. During the day, they hid in caves, swamps, or thick forests. The food was scarce, often limited to roots, wild fruits, and the occasional animal hunted by Moses and other men who had learned to wear makeshift arches. Clean water had become a precious luxury. Wounds infected easily, and the medicines prepared by Hannah and Sarah had been over weeks ago. In August, they came to know that a special force of 120 gunmen followed their trail. The governor of Virginia had convinced Pennsylvania and New York authorities to unite efforts to capture fugitives. Professional slave hunters, indigenous trackers paid to the weight of gold, and voluntary militia formed a group determined to recapture not only slaves, but especially Hannah, whose name now inspired terror throughout the southeast region. Hannah knew they couldn't overcome their persecutors just for speed. The group included seniors and children, and all were exhausted after months of escape. He gathered his advice, Isaiah, Moses, Sarah, and for a difficult decision. "We have to divide," he proposed in a firm voice. "I will go east with 5 volunteers, leaving clues obvious. You will lead the rest to the north, to Canada." The group vehemently protested. "We won't leave her behind," Moses insisted. "We got here together." Hannah smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'm not sacrificing myself. I'm buying time. We'll meet again in Montreal when the snow melts." But everyone there, including herself, knew it was a promise that would probably not be fulfilled. The next morning, after painful farewells, Hannah left with 5 volunteer men, all young, strong, and determined like her. They left visible marks of their passage, lit fires larger than necessary, left clues that any median tracker could follow. The plan worked. 3 days later, they learned from a traveler that the main group of persecutors had changed direction, following their false trail. For 2 weeks, Hannah and his companions led the persecutors an increasingly distant circle of the main group. They crossed rivers to swim, climbed rocky slopes, entered the treacherous swamps. 2 of his companions succumbed to the exhaustion, one taken by the current of a river, another by the right shot of a hunter who had seen them at a distance. But the stratagem was working. Each day, the main group of fugitives gained more distance toward freedom. In the first week of September, Hannah and the remaining 3 men arrived at a mountainous region on the border between Pennsylvania and New York. Hungry, exhausted, and sick, they knew they could not keep running away. "This is where we will make our last resistance," said Hannah, choosing a small abandoned cabin on top of a slope. From there they could see any approach, and the only access trail was close enough for only one man to pass at a time. They prepared as they could, collecting stones to throw, sharpening wooden stakes, digging pits disguised with foliage. Hannah distributed the last medicinal herbs she carried, instructing men to mask them for extra strength. "When dawn," she said, "we'll be free or dead. There are no more escapes from here." That night, sitting around a small fire inside the cabin, the four shared stories of their lives before the captivity. Almost erased memories of childhood in Africa, songs of long-lost mothers, dreams of futures who have never been allowed to imagine. Hannah spoke little, but heard with intensity, as if he wanted to memorize each word to take them beyond this life. At dawn, they spotted the first line of persecutors climbing the slope. More than 60 men armed with muskets, pistols, and whips, led by Thomas Miller, the former foreman of the Blackwood plantation, which had sworn to bring back to Hannah's head in a stake. The siege lasted 3 days. The attackers, confident of their numerical superiority, initially advanced without caution, losing 12 men in the trails prepared on the trail. They retreated, regrouped, and adopted a new strategy, a slow siege, cutting access to water and food. Inside the cabin, the four resisted with fierce determination. One of them, Jacob, had been shot in the shoulder, but continued to fight, moving through the cabin with an unusable arm. On the morning of the third day, the attackers managed to set the cabin roof on fire. The smoke soon made the air breathable. "We have to go out," shouted Elijah, the youngest in the group, while coughing violently. Hannah watched the flames for a moment, then smiled with a strange serenity. "Yes," he agreed, "but not as prisoners." The four gathered in the center of the booth on fire. Hannah took a small wrapping of fabric out of her clothes, her last treasure guarded. From within, he removed the mother of pearl button that had belonged to his mother. He kissed him and arrested him on his hair. "When I tell you 3, he said, "we go out together. They don't stop for anything. They run directly to them." The cabin's doors opened with violence and 4 figures emerged from smoke, running directly to the line of snipers. Thomas Miller, surprised by the suicidal tactic, hesitated for a second before giving the order. "Shoot! Shoot everyone!" The discharge of muskets echoed through the mountains. Jacob fell first, hit in the chest. Elijah was the second, his young body pierced by 3 bullets. Samuel managed to advance further, dropping 2 strikers before 5 shots dropped him. Hannah, for some miracle or supernatural determination, continued to advance even after being hit. He reached Thomas Miller, grabbed him by the throat with surprising force to someone of his size, and his eyes fixed on his with terrible intensity. "Remember this name," she whispered as her life left her body. "Richmond's Hannah. I won't be the last one." Hannah's body was taken back to Richmond, aired in the central square as a warning to the slaves to feed rebellion ideas. His head was separated from the body and placed in a stake at the entrance of the reconstructed plantation of the Blackwood, now administered by a distant cousin of the original family. Authorities believed that this brutal demonstration would discourage new revolts. They were wrong. In the weeks following the death of Hannah, reports of strange phenomena began to circulate. Slaves swore he saw a woman in a white dress walking among the tobacco rows in the old Blackwood plantation, always at dawn. Some gentlemen reported waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling of hands squeezing their throats, just to find the empty room. Where Hannah's body had been buried, an unmarked ditch on the edge of a swamp, wildflowers grew suddenly, forming a perfect circle. Richmond residents avoided passing near the site after the nightfall. Slave children whispered that if you were quiet near the ruins of the old house big on Friday after the full moon, you could hear Hannah singing in an old tongue. High society's white ladies started sleeping with crucifixes under the pillows, while their husbands checked doors and windows twice before they retired. But the deepest effect in Hannah's history manifested itself in the enslaved community. Its name became code, whispered from ear to ear, from plantation to plantation. Doing as Hannah meant resisting at any cost. Coded songs on it circulated in the fields, apparently innocent to the ears of the overseers, but loaded with meaning for those who knew how to interpret. Small buttons of the mother of pearl, have become secret symbols of resistance, hand to talismans. The main group Hannah had helped escape reached Canada in the winter of 1793. Isaiah, Moses, Sarah, and for the small community near Montreal, which in the following years would serve as a support point for other fugitives. They kept alive the memory of Hannah, turning her story into a narrative that mixed facts and mythical elements. A woman who had challenged an entire system and, in a way, had won, even in defeat. Decades later, historians would debate the veracity of events in the Blackwood plantation. Official documents were mysteriously destroyed in a fire in the Richmond file in 1812. Witness reports contradicted themselves in important details. Academics would try to reduce Hannah to a footnote in the history of slave resistance, arguing that his influence was exaggerated by oral tradition. But in black communities, from generation to generation, the stories continued. A play on her was secretly staged in New Orleans in 1850. An anonymous leaflet circulated in Philadelphia in 1855, narrating his life. During the Civil War, black soldiers' regiments carried small buttons of mother of pearl sewn inside their uniforms. In 1889, a 104-year-old survivor from the community founded by Isaiah and the others gave an interview to a local Montreal newspaper. Hannah didn't die that day in the mountains, the old man insisted. She comes back whenever injustice becomes unbearable. She is the whisper you hear when you decide that it is enough. It is the strength you find when you think you can no longer continue. In remaining plantations after abolition, in secret meetings of civil rights organizations in the early 20th century, in protests in the following decades, the name of Hannah periodically resurfaces, not as a historical figure, but as a timeless symbol of resistance. To this day, in Richmond, it is said that at dawn on Holy Friday, if you go through the old Blackwood property, now a state historical park, you can feel an aroma of medicinal herbs in the air. In some old houses in the region, residents report that locks open alone on this date, windlass gates, and occasionally a female figure is briefly seen, stopped by the beds, watching those who sleep with eyes that carry the weight of centuries of memory. For those who know their history, Richmond Hannah was never just a woman who lived and died in 1793. She is a constant presence, a reminder that true freedom sometimes requires the unimaginable to face. His spirit continues to walk in the shadows of American history, whispering that against oppression there will always be resistance, that against cruelty there will always be courage, that even in the darker hours, one will be willing to wield the blade of justice. If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video, if Hannah's story touched her heart. Share Hannah's memory never forgotten.